Hi, this is Chris Young, and thank you for joining me for the fourth episode of Contemplating Life. Today we're going to continue talking about disability issues. In our recent episodes, we talked about what it means to be inspiring, and we talked about ableism. Today we began a two-part series on the language used to describe disability. I previously mentioned I was tending to present the standard party line views on a topic, and then explaining how I disagreed with parts of that position. Today we're going to turn things around a bit. Having lived with a disability for 67 years, I haven't kept up with modern terminology and definitions. So I'm going to begin by explaining the terminology I've used for more than half of my life, and I'll explain my reluctance to abandon those old definitions. Then I'll talk about how I've recently come to appreciate newer ways of approaching the definition of disability. Using the proper language to talk about disability isn't just a case of being politically correct. The language that we use to describe disability is a reflection of our attitude about disability, and that affects the attitudes of others. Words have power. Words have meaning. If we're going to wield that power responsibly and sensitively, we need to understand the real meaning of the words we use. Now, pardon me for a little bit while I go off on a bit of a philosophical tangent and talk about words in general. What is a word? Well, a word is an abstraction. It's a way that allows us to talk about things that are not necessarily present, or are themselves abstractions with no physical form. I just said that words are about communication, but it goes much deeper than that. We think using words. When we think about something, we use words in an internal monologue. Sometimes we have feelings or experiences that are beyond words. This not only illustrates the inadequacy of language to communicate these things, but it also limits our ability to reflect upon them, think about them, or analyze their meaning in our lives. We can remember such feelings and experiences, and perhaps through such recollection, relive them. But when it comes to thinking, we're limited by the inadequacy of words. Now, people who speak foreign languages often find themselves thinking in those languages as well. The only foreign language I ever studied was French, and I got terrible grades in it, so I'm no expert on this topic. As poorly as I performed in French, on rare occasions I find myself recalling a French idiom or phrase that doesn't have a good English equivalent. And in those circumstances, I've been able to actually think in French. I can only imagine what it's like for someone who has a good mastery of several languages. It gives them the ability to contemplate things differently and have a richer experience of understanding. That must be phenomenal. Words require consensus. Words have context. When either consensus or context is absent, words become meaningless. When I say that words are an abstraction subject to consensus and context, let me give some examples. If I say to you the word elephant, I've imparted to you an image of a large gray animal with tree trunk legs, big floppy ears, and a long prehensile nose. Now, simply speaking the word elephant doesn't cause one to appear in front of you. There's nothing special about the sound of the word, nor the sequence of letters of its written form that necessarily ties it to that particular creature. It's only by consensus that the sound and sequence of letters have been assigned as a label for that particular animal. This idea of consensus is illustrated by the fact that different geographical areas with different cultural traditions have different languages and assign different words to the same object. Now, as it turns out, the word elephant, translated into other languages, sounds roughly the same. But for a different example, the English word for a small hopping amphibian is frog. In German, it's
Frosch,
in Spanish, it's
rana,
in French, it's
la grenouille,
and so on for countless other languages. Different populations and cultures, different consensus, different words. Context is also very important. For example, the word frog can be a hopping reptile, or it can be a derogatory term for French people. And that elephant in the room can be either physical or metaphorical. Context is important. Again, without consensus and context, words are meaningless, or at least they should be. Sometimes we make up our own consensus and context and misinterpret words. The words we assign to animals or objects are not likely to evolve over time. However, the meaning of other words has evolved throughout history as the consensus and the context evolve over time. The words that we use to describe race, gender, and disability are much more likely to evolve as our attitudes about these topics have evolved. For example, the technical name for dark-skinned people of African descent is the Negro race. That evolved into that pejorative N-word. And then, as an attempt to be less offensive, people used the phrase colored person. But that phrase has so many roots in segregation, such as colored only or no colored allowed, that it also has a highly negative context. With a sense of pride, people began describing themselves as black and or African American. Today, both are considered socially acceptable. The consensus has evolved, but context is important as well. It's only through context that when we say the phrase African American, you don't have to wonder if the person was perhaps a Caucasian born in South Africa and living in Mexico, or perhaps of Middle Eastern Arab descent living in Canada, or a person born in Israel living in Argentina, even though technically the label African American would apply to each of these three. By the way, given the negative history of the phrase colored people, I'm not quite sure why people of color is acceptable and doesn't carry the same stigma. But that's probably a topic for a different episode. And hey, I'm just an old liberal white guy, so what do I know about that? The language used to describe gender and the use of a variety of pronouns also reflect our evolving views on gender. The language we use to describe disability has similarly evolved, and that's what we really want to talk about today. This discussion flows right out of last week's topic of ableism. Not only have the words we use to describe disability evolved during my lifetime, but my own views about those words have also evolved significantly, even in recent months. Let's explore some definitions of words, and I'll tell you about the way I learned them when I was growing up. Typically, I begin with either a disease or a medical condition. While there are technical differences between the two, it generally starts with one or the other of those. I have a disease. It's a genetic neuromuscular disease called spinal muscular atrophy type 2. There are probably a dozen or more types of neuromuscular diseases. Other examples of diseases that cause disability include polio, cancer, diabetes, hemophilia, AIDS, and diseases related to blindness and vision impairment, or deafness and hearing impairment. Diseases can be genetic or acquired. Somewhat different from diseases are other medical conditions typically caused by accident or injury, for example, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, or cerebral palsy, which is usually caused by a lack of oxygen at birth. Technically, these are not considered diseases. Now, this distinction between disease and medical condition is not a hard and fast line. I suppose technically you could say that some diseases cause medical conditions. For example, HIV causes AIDS. My concept of disability is that it's a consequence of a disease or a medical condition. A disability is something that you are literally disable to do. In my case, it's primarily a mobility disability. I never had the necessary physical strength to walk or stand. And as my disease has progressed, I've lost what limited use of my arms that I once had. Now I only have minimal use of a few fingers. Other disabled people have paralysis and a lack of sensation, or perhaps a lack of muscle control, as in cerebral palsy. Some cannot see, hear, or speak. As I was growing up, and for most of my life, the most common word used to describe disabled people was handicapped. For various reasons, some of which I still don't understand, nor do I agree with, the word handicapped has fallen out of favor. Let me define handicapped the way I felt it was used when I was younger, and it was a commonly accepted terminology. Under those definitions, there was a difference between handicap and disability. The disability was your basic limitation caused by your disease or medical condition, as we described earlier. Your handicap was the interaction between that disability and your environment. When your disability prevents you from doing things that you reasonably want to do, or that society and your environment expect you to be able to do, then it becomes a handicap. Now, the general meaning of handicap is it's some sort of disadvantage that you have. One of the phrases which disabled people often object to is, "We all have disabilities." That's sort of the disability version of the statement, "All lives matter." However, under these technical definitions of disability, as I defined it, that statement is true. Here are some examples of disabilities that everyone has. You can't fly through the air like Superman, nor do you have his strength, X-ray vision, heat vision, or other superpowers. You can't stretch out your limbs like Reed Richards for the Fantastic Four, or turn invisible like Susan Storm. You can't read minds like Professor X of the X-Men. These are all disabilities we share. While it might be fun to possess the superpowers of our comic book heroes, no one really expects to be able to do those things, and nobody else expects you to be able to do those things. You don't live in an environment designed primarily for those who have such abilities. Therefore, these disabilities don't present us with a handicap. Under these definitions, it's possible to have a disability that does not handicap you. Now, let me give an example. We'll call it hypothetical, but it's based on a real person I knew who went to the same special education grade school that I went to. Our subject has osteogenesis imperfecta, which is commonly known as brittle bone disease. It's the same disability that advocate Stella Young had when we discussed her back in episode 1. Like most people with OI, his growth was stunted, and he's a little person. He also uses a power wheelchair. After I knew him in grade school, he went on to earn a law degree, and he has a successful practice, which includes being a consultant for companies regarding ADA and Section 504 compliance. At one time, I considered becoming a lawyer, and this guy has a career I would have liked to have had if I had become a lawyer. He's married, he has a son, He drives his own specially equipped van. His law practice is thriving. Now, while I can't honestly say what his day-to-day life is like or what challenges he's faced, by my definition, he is disabled, but he has few, if any, handicaps. Through technology, accommodations, support systems, his disability doesn't significantly limit his capacity to do the things he wants to do, or the things which society expects him to do, or his environment assumes he can do. Now, one of the phrases that disabled people often object to is the idea that you can overcome a disability. Now, I totally agree that short of a medical cure that removes the underlying cause of the disability, you can't overcome it. You live with it, you cope with it, maybe you die from it. In contrast, you can overcome a handicap. It bothered me when the word handicap was phased out in favor of disability, especially when it comes to government programs. It was my belief that programs should help people with handicaps because that's something you can do something about. Now, as we discussed last week, no amount of accommodation, support systems, technology, or other benefits short of a medical cure is going to eliminate a disability. But these support systems can make a huge difference in mitigating or even eliminating one's handicap. Now, my lawyer acquaintance might be eligible for a variety of government programs, many of which he may not need. Because he's disabled, he's still eligible. In previous legal definitions, he would not be eligible because he's not handicapped. Now, all of the above is based on my definitions of the words handicapped and disabled, and I believe they represent the views of most of the disability community as I was growing up and in my young adult years. But as we'll see, these definitions have evolved over time, and it's taken me some time to comprehend and appreciate how they've evolved. Some of my concerns about the transition from handicap to disability have been addressed as I've gotten deeper into the subject. A little over a year ago, famous YouTuber Shane Burkaw, who has the same type of SMA as I have, created a video called Things You Should Never Say to a Disabled Person. The word never was in all caps. Shane and his wife Hannah post videos several times a week talking about their life as an interabled couple. I highly recommend their YouTube channel, and I'll provide a link in the description. I really liked about 90% of what they had to say, and I was inspired to create a reaction video of my own, which you can also find linked here. Shane spoke out against the use of the word handicap, and ever since then, I've tried to do research on why the word has not only fallen out of favor, but is considered objectionable to many disabled people. I listened carefully to what Shane had to say. I also read the book Disability Pride by Ben Matlin, which I referenced in previous episodes. And I researched other online sources on the topic. I still believe there's nothing objectionable about the word handicap as I defined it and as many people defined it when I was growing up. I also still insist that there's a distinct difference in meaning between disability and handicap. However, my disappointment or objection to it being phased out has somewhat diminished. So, here's what I've learned from my research about the word handicap. The origin of the word handicap comes from a medieval game called Hand in Cap, in which players trade items in the presence of a neutral umpire. According to Wikipedia, the game goes as follows. The umpire decides whether the items are the same value, And if not, what is the difference in value? Both players and the umpire then place forfeit money in a cap. Both players then place a hand in the cap and withdraw it. An open hand means you agree with the evaluation of the umpire, and a closed hand means you disagree. If both players agree, then the assessed valuation difference is paid, the items are traded, and the umpire gets the forfeit money. If both players disagree, no trade occurs, and the umpire still gets the forfeit money. If one player agrees and the other disagrees, there's no trade, and the player who agreed gets the forfeit money. The concept of a neutral third party trying to even things up was extended to handicapped horse racing. If a particular horse was thought to have an undue advantage, officials would determine that it had to carry a specific amount of extra weight to make the race more competitive. In the early 20th century, derived from the idea of handicapped races, the term handicap began to be applied to disabled people because they carried a greater burden. In contrast, Shane and other people make the claim that the word handicap originates from disabled street beggars who would sit on the sidewalk with their cap in hand, begging for money. Now, I can agree that if someone made the connection between someone with their hat in their hand and a disabled person, the word handicap might somehow bring forth that image. Note, I specifically used the phrase hat in hand because I think that's the more common way to describe beggars. I don't think I ever heard it described as cap in hand, and even if it was, how do you then reverse cap in hand to hand in cap and thus handicap? It just doesn't make sense. Now, I was born in 1955. I went to a school that was described as a school for the handicapped. It was the common word in usage throughout all my school years and much of my adult life. For instance, I recently came across an old videotape I had shot at the 1983 Indiana Governor's Conference on the Handicapped. I know the word was being used not only in government, but also in the broader community in the mid-1980s. My guess is it was used several years beyond that. By the way, there's a link to the video in the description here. In all of that time, among the extremely few people I encountered who were beginning to prefer disability over handicap, I never once heard the excuse that their objections were based on the idea that it portrays us stereotypically as beggars. Until recently, I never heard any discussion, either positive or negative, regarding the origin of the word. We just didn't talk about where the word came from. We were aware of the connection of handicap as it relates to sports, but I never heard the origin of the word or why it was used in sports or disability language, either one. Shane, my man, I respect you. I love what you do to bust stereotypes and educate people about disability issues. But I have to say, I think you're off the mark when you object to handicap based on its alleged origin regarding beggars. Handicap has other meanings, not only in horse racing, but in golf, chess, bowling, perhaps other sports. You can easily make the connection between that medieval game and the use of the word in these sports. Why would the word handicap have as its origin the idea of a beggar when it's used in sports? Now, handicap does imply a burden or a disadvantage, and I can understand why disabled people don't want to perpetuate the view that they're burdened or that they are a burden. But then again, go back to my rant last week, and you'll see I find nothing objectionable about the idea that a handicap or a disability can be burdensome. It's a burden I endure with as much grace as I can muster, but it is a burden nevertheless. Video from the Governor's Conference on the Handicapped from 1983, the word handicap was always used in a positive light. But there was other language that today we would consider blatantly ableist. In the opening invocation and in the governor's keynote address, there were tributes to Indiana State Senator Charles E. Bosma, who had recently passed away. Senator Bosma was a fierce advocate for disabled people. However, at a couple of points, he was described as being an advocate for those less fortunate than us, and the downtrodden and oppressed. If the connection between the word handicap and the idea of bearing a burden perpetuates ableist attitudes, then I can understand why it's been phased out in favor of disability. But note that transition has not been smooth within the disability community. There have been, and may still be, people who see the word disabled as being synonymous with useless or incapable. They would say that handicapped is an acceptable term, even if it does imply a disadvantage, because realistically, that's accurate. It's better to be accurately described at being a disadvantage than the implication that you're incapacitated and by extension worthless. Now obviously, I have no negative feelings about either term. As I mentioned earlier, part of the reason I mourn the loss of the word handicap is its use in legal definitions, especially entitlement programs. However, my research has shown that the current legal definition of disability is written in such a way that it's a functional definition. Now here's an example. At one time, the definition of developmental disability was a disability with onset before age 22, and it included, I'm quoting, mental retardation, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, and other similar conditions, end quote. This is the same sort of medically based definition of disability that I grew up with. The new definition of developmental disability also speaks of onset before age 22, but it goes on to say that it is a disability that requires a variety of interdisciplinary services that results in substantial functional limitation in at least 3 of the following major life activities: self-care, understanding and use of language, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. Under the old definition, my medical condition of a neuromuscular disease didn't qualify as DD. Yet my friend Christopher Lee, who had cerebral palsy, did qualify. While our medical diagnoses were different, the types of services we need are very similar. Under the new definition, I have substantial functional limitation in 4 of the 7 listed areas. They are self-care, mobility, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. Thus, I qualify for programs for developmentally disabled people. So in other words, the legal definitions of disability are no longer medically based. They're functionally based. The new definition of disability is extremely close to my traditional definition of handicap. So in some ways, I feel better about the transition between the words as I have felt for many years. Ben Matlin reports that people have lost ADA accommodation lawsuits even though they appeared to have a disability. The loss was based on the idea they already had sufficient technology or accommodations to meet their needs. Under my old definitions, the court might have ruled you are disabled but not handicapped. In my video response to Shane, and in other blog posts and essays, I've argued that if handicap is not the correct word to describe the way in which your disability interacts with your environment, then we need a different word. But in some ways, that was because I was stuck on a medical model of disability. So, if disability now refers to the environmental and social interaction rather than a medical model, do we need a new word for the medically based concept of disability that I've used for years? I need to do some more research, but I think the common practice is to talk about a social definition of disability, sometimes also called a functional definition of disability, versus a medical definition. Now, if you're going to add those adjectives, then I'm satisfied we're on the same page. But I think there are a lot of people, especially my age, and possibly in the general able population, who hear the word disability and think of the medical model. So if the default definition of disability is a social or functional disability, then we have a lot of education to do to make sure that people really understand we're talking about interaction with expectations and environment in the same sense that I used to define handicapped, and not with the old medical model. It seems the consensus has not caught up to the new context. Now, I have much more to say about language related to disability, but we need to wrap up this episode. In next week's episode of Contemplating Life, we'll talk about the ways in which the general public co-opts, misuses, and abuses disability language in a highly offensive manner. As always, I welcome your comments. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider supporting me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and any other benefits I might come up with down the road. It's not that I'm desperate for money, but hey, a little extra income sure could help. My deepest appreciation to my Patreon supporters. Your affirmation of my work means more than I can describe. And even if you can't provide financial support, please, please, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe.